I'm Amy Hamilton with Hamilton Native Outpost. This is the first video in a series of 3 on quail management. This first video is about quail nesting and brood rearing habitat. I am visiting with Quail Hedges, a wildlife management biologist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. He manages around 20,000 acres of public land in Missouri. Biologists are troubled that quail have been extirpated from 3 states east of the Mississippi, despite a conservation focus on improving habitat. Kyle and his research partner, Frank Lonkerich, led the largest quail research study in Missouri. What surprised me most from the study is that grazing is needed to create prime quail habitat. Here at Hamilton Native Outpost, we produce native seeds and are home of diverse native grasslands, good for beef, birds, and butterflies. Join Kyle and me in one of those diverse native plantings as we dive into 3 things that quail need in their habitat.
So quail need 3 basic habitat types, and they must have all 3 of these. Without any one of them, the population cannot exist. They need diverse herbaceous cover, so that's grasses and forbs. Can't have all grasses, so there's a lot more involved in that. Diverse herbaceous cover, thermal cover, typically in the form of woody structure, but can be herbaceous canopy plants, and bare ground. Bare ground is one that's often overlooked. We have to have space between plants. When I'm talking bare ground, I'm not saying a food disc field over here and a grass strip over there. I'm talking about space between plants for birds to be able to move around in. So specifically today, we're here in the middle of summer, and of course it's still brood rearing and nesting time. Our research found that the nesting season actually goes all summer. It was once believed in Missouri that June 15th was the peak quail hatch, and after about July 15th, most of it was over. Well, that's not true. We found nesting to occur all summer. Even we had some birds hatch in September and even the first week of October. So nesting continues all summer. We need all those components, all 3 components, diverse herbaceous cover, thermal cover, and bare ground, year-round. But specifically, the plant types they'll use will change, and the thermal cover they'll use can change season to season, from summer and into winter. Right now we're going to look at some summer habitat. So historically we had the disturbances that created grasslands and even savannas was fire. Some of that was natural, but a lot of it was from Native Americans intentionally setting fire, right? And they were doing that for a variety of reasons, but one of them was to attract game, for pyrrhic herbivory. Freshly burned stuff attracts grazers, so then they could control where their next meal was going to come from. Well, the quail have evolved with this as well, right? And so in Missouri, we're typically 45 to 50-inch rainfall country, okay? Basically, to have prime quail populations, we get too much rain. The habitat gets too thick. And we have removed most of the historical disturbances. Most people know that in grassland and savanna systems that fire was a historical disturbance, but people seem to forget that grazing was too, right? It wasn't modern day cattle. It was different animals. That's just as important. We had that move across the landscape, and so did fire. We have removed, because of urbanization and a variety of things, we've removed those disturbances. Our research showed that quail broods, the #1 most successful units that they were found in on grassland sites, were areas that were both burned and grazed. Well, it makes sense. We've already talked about we need some of that interstitial space. We need some bare ground between plants, right? It gets too thick otherwise. They need to be able to move around without getting wet and getting hypothermia when they're young. That's what burning and grazing does. It creates this variety of structure and this variety of plants, and then the chicks are able to navigate through that. The second most successful unit for broods was burned only. And the third most successful was grazed only. Any kind of disturbance is critically important. The most avoided units for young broods was idle. Anything that hadn't been burned, grazed, or somehow disturbed in the previous 12 months was disproportionately avoided. Quail chicks won't go in it. Again, it's because it gets too thick. We get too much rainfall most years. It gets too thick, they just can't move around through that. So we need disturbance intervals on a regular basis to come through. It's a natural process, and we remove those natural processes. That not only affects the quail, it affects the incomplete ecosystem that we're dealing with.
So grazing is certainly part of the design for quail on the landscape.
Absolutely. They respond to it. They evolved with it. So that provides the vegetation they remove is important. The hoof action that they put on the ground is important. The trailing makes some travel routes for quail. Even the manure deposit and all that goes with nutrient cycling is important. So every aspect of it, the bugs that are attracted to manure deposits can provide quail food. So the whole thing is a complex, interwoven machine, and we need to keep all those disturbances intact.
You know, you're saying the landscape has changed a lot from settlement time. And I was reading the Texas County History book, and they were saying that actually prairie chickens were over here in Elk Creek, which is, you know, just a creek here adjacent to our farm, that we actually had prairie chickens on Elk Creek.
So it obviously shows you how open the landscape was back then. The lack of fire has resulted in a lot of timber, a lot of forested acres that weren't here historically. A lot of the Ozarks were way more open, glades and savannas and woodlands than they are now. So, yep, removing those disturbances has completely altered our entire landscape. So let's talk a little bit about nesting and brood rearing cover. And brood rearing cover is probably the most limiting factor for quail across the entire range. A variety of reasons west to east of why it's lacking. But here in Missouri, it's lacking typically 3 problems. One, it doesn't exist in a forage situation because it's grazed down to nothing, right? Introduced cool season forages grazed down to nothing. There is no brood rearing habitat. Crop situation, again, there's no brood rearing habitat because we have broad spectrum herbicides that reduce any weed growth. Weeds are good for quail. Quail like them. The other factor then is too thick. Most people don't think about this. So if we don't graze even our natives, or burn them, or some combination of both, or our introduced cool seasons are left idle, or maybe hayed and then left idle the rest of the year. So there's a period where there's nothing if they're hayed, but then it gets too thick. So because we're missing that bare ground. So this nesting and brood rearing component and the bare ground, they go hand in hand, right? That's all tied together as one component. So we need these plants. We need bunch grasses, right? Bunch grasses that have a tight base and umbrella out. So that is in itself providing some interstitial space, overhead cover, the way it branches out, plants like some of these are all around here. And then in some of that space is going to grow some of the broadleaves. The broadleaves is what's going to attract the insects and also provide our winter seeds for food later. So the broadleaves are providing the year-round food just in different components, right? They're going to nest right in the base of these warm season clumps of grass.
So Kyle, a lot of times in our rotation from one unit to the next, we'll have 45-day rest periods or sometimes even longer for regrowth. Is this important to have enough time for a quail to initiate nesting and to hatch out that nest?
It can be. The glory of grazing natives, and we'll see it as we go out into these units, is the quail can nest and brood rear right amongst the cattle actually. The way you're grazing, of course, is different than grazing introduced cool seasons. So we don't have the graze to a pool table effect. So there's an opportunity for birds to actually be nesting while the cattle are in the unit. So this is a typical warm season grass nesting clump. This is what we consider provides the appropriate nesting substrate. And so these hen quail, they'll make a tunnel into the base of something like this, and they'll get right in the middle of a clump like this and lay their eggs, make a nest, and then they'll break some grass and pull it down over their head for overhead protection. But I want to show this because notice how this has been grazed. The cattle were just pulled out of here a day ago. So it shows that easily quail could still be nesting in here while cattle were grazing. They don't step up on the clumps like this. That's uncomfortable. That's just not natural. So they ate off the top of this, but they never disturbed the base of this plant. So it provides an opportunity for quail to nest while the animals are actively grazing in the unit.
And look at all the nesting clumps left after the last graze.
If we picture this, but being across the entire pasture, right? Chicks can't move through this. But in this scenario, it's only a spot that's the size of a pie plate. Chicks can move around all through here and navigate, and there's plenty of bare ground and lack of vegetation for them to be able to move around and forage. So that's the problem with ungrazed, undisturbed, is getting solid areas like this. And just picture this having vegetation, 2 or 3 feet tall on top of this. There's no way little chicks can maneuver through that. So this is an example of an ungrazed unit, unburned, ungrazed. And you can see how thick and robust this vegetation gets. This is August. It's had all season. Here's some old growth. There's just duff. You can't get to the ground. Chicks, there's no way chicks could navigate through this. Adult quail probably couldn't navigate through this, but for sure chicks just can't move around. They can't get down to the ground level. So there's no way to move around and forage in here. It's just a wall of vegetation. And that's what happens with the lack of disturbance in our rainfall regime. So there's a variety of grazing techniques, with diverse natives, and some people utilize patch burn grazing. That's what I do on some of my areas. Adaptive grazing, rotational grazing. There's a lot of different names for different styles of grazing. The bottom line is most grazing systems on diverse natives work well for quail. Some are going to work a little better than others, but most grazing systems, because of the different structure heights and the plant diversity, result in better quail production.
So Kyle, what else makes cover for quail here during the summertime?
So that last component that we need, we've talked about the herbaceous component in the bare ground. We've got to have some type of thermal cover. And that's typically found in the form of shrubs, plums, dogwoods, things like that. But it doesn't have to be. In the summertime, there's other surrogates that can fit with that. And whether it's woody or herbaceous, what we need is a place for birds to get shade. They got to cool off. In Missouri, sometimes where a heat index is over 100 degrees, it just gets too hot. So scattered throughout areas where they would be foraging, like here, we can have stuff just like this. This is a perfect example. So this is some sunflowers that are regrowing since the cows have been out of here about a month, I understand.
Yes.
So this alone provides enough cover. I'm looking down and I can't really see through it. So we're trying to have an overhead screen so hawks aren't a threat. They can hide underneath here. But if we look down under here, there's plenty of shade. And there's plenty of open ground underneath too. It's not thick, thatchy vegetation. So they can have airflow and be in the shade and get cooled off. So they'll forage around and then they'll take a break in the shade. Ideally, this will also have insects and inverts in it, so they can be picking bugs as they pass through shady places like this and also have that airflow. So this kind of structure, this is the beauty of broadleaf plants. That can provide us the thermal cover they need in the summertime scattered throughout the brood rearing habitat without necessarily having to have hard woody cover present.
So this is a Maximilian sunflower here that was grazed down fairly well during the last graze about a month ago. And then we have, you know, it regrowing right here, making this thermal cover. Here in the background, you can see a lot of these sunflowers weren't grazed quite as hard, and they are growing more leaf here as we go up the stalk.
And even these that don't get grazed and start back over, the glory of these is a lot of them will produce a head and produce seed. So they may not function in one fashion for the quail, but if they produce a seed and some of that seed shatters, then it's food later in the year for those birds as well.
Yeah, this field will just be yellow with sunflowers blooming here in just a little bit. So another aspect that I like about grazing, you know, these sunflowers, a lot of times we in agriculture don't think we ought to have these stemmy plants, you know, in our pastures. They just don't belong here. And, you know, what I find is what is not palatable to the cattle can make cover for this nesting habitat that we're talking. It can be give us overhead protection from aerial predators. Mm-hmm. And then later on it goes to the ground and makes cover on the ground so that we have a more effective water cycle. Just like mulching our garden, this here mulch holds water into the soil, and otherwise the water is wicking up from deeper depths in the soil, and then it just wicks out into the atmosphere, and it's really not being used by the plants to actually grow. And then we don't have it, you know, when the plants are wanting to grow in the middle of a dry season, you know, we've wicked that moisture out of the ground. Kyle, tell us a little bit about what quail eat during the year, throughout the year.
So yeah, starts out in the springtime, and it's really important. This diversity becomes really important. They're starting to pair up, right, for nesting. And nesting is a heavy investment, a physical investment for the hen. So it takes a lot of nutrition. So in our diverse fields, we have a variety of plants that are greening up at different times. So a lot of the seeds are as depleted as they will get. They've been eaten on by rodents and birds and all kinds of things all winter, right? So the seed supply is very limited. So they'll still be eating seeds where they're available, but they start eating a lot of green shoots of vegetation. And that prepares them for nesting. And then early green up provides some early insect and invertebrate usage. And so as soon as they can start eating those highly nutritious invertebrates and insects, that really helps them get them prepared for nesting. As we transition into summer and as nests are hatching, those broods, it's almost solely living off of insects and invertebrates. Critical component.
Kyle, I've noticed in our some of our production units of Coreopsis, this is a plant that greens up really early in the springtime, that you know, there's a larva that comes in on these Coreopsis you know, in the month of April. Is this here, you know, one of the food types that you're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So any of those small caterpillars that come on early green up like that is wonderful. So that's providing a high nutrition source going into that nesting season and preparing those hens for being able to produce eggshells and lay those eggs.
After talking with Kyle about how important insects are in a quail's diet, I took him to another diverse planting that was really busy with pollinators and insects.
So we see lots of more variety of pollinators and just insects and inverts in general in these high diversity plantings. When we get into monocultures or even maybe plantings that only have 2, 3, 4 species, you're just not going to see the diversity, right? There's certain insects need certain plants. Maybe their larva needs one type of plant, maybe they pollinate off of 10 different species of plants. If we're in a planting that only has 2 or 3 types of plants, it's only going to harbor certain insects. So if you really look around, some of these species are using certain plants in here. Some of them are on these flowers, some are on these flowers, some are lower in the structure, in the column, you know. So you get this variety. Anytime you get plant diversity, you're going to get insect diversity, which is critically important for quail.
If diverse natives are so good for quail, why do we often associate quail with cropland?
Oftentimes, quail managed traditionally, and not only on public land, but on private land as well. And traditionally, I mean the food plot idea, the strip cropped areas. And the fallacy there is that it comes from people when they're hunting. When you hunt quail in fall and winter, right? So oftentimes, hunters find quail along a crop field or a food plot. Well, if that's where I find them and that's where I shoot them, then that must be important for quail, right? So I should do that across my entire landscape. The thing is, that's not where those quail were produced. We have to produce quail first. Now, I'll admit, they will readily use a crop field or a food plot. We often eat at fast food restaurants. That doesn't mean it's the most healthy situation for us. So these birds will utilize a big seed source. It's quick. The less times they have to bend their head down, the less time they're worried about getting killed by a hawk. They can get back to a thicket or some shrubby cover and hide out for the rest of the day, right? But native seeds are way more nutritious for them. But they will utilize cropped acres just for a quick meal. It doesn't mean that's the most healthy for them. So we see that applied oftentimes where people, well, I'm always killing quail over by this milo food plot, so I need more milo. Well, that milo food plot, when it's disced up, that's no habitat. So there's this, it takes a while before that grows up. Depends on what chemicals are used. There may or may not be weeds in that. So it may not be good brood habitat. So there's a lot of the year that milo food plot or soybeans or whatever we're using may not be usable space. A lot of our traditional management, too thick a grass, and our food plots aren't usable for much of the year. A system like this, where we're grazing natives, this provides year-round usable space. So every acre of this should be available for quail to utilize spring, summer, fall, and winter. They don't have to pick up and move here for the spring and raise their chicks over here for the summer and then over here for the winter. When you're only that big, that's a lot of movement. That's hard to expect them to thrive doing that. So if we can provide maximized usable space on our acreage, we're going to maximize quail production.
Sometimes we get in the mindset that conservation and cattle are at odds. It has been really interesting to me hearing from Kyle about how grazing, fire, and diversity are beneficial for healthy quail. We at Hamilton saw how important diversity was for our cattle too. We developed plantings that include native plants that work together from 4 functional diversity groups: warm season grasses, cool season grasses, wildflowers, and legumes. This means the planting is growing year-round instead of brown and dormant part of the year. Mimicking Mother Nature just makes sense. Join us in the next video as I talk with Kyle about what quail need during the rest of the year outside of nesting and brood rearing.